Okay, so welcome to a new Reedsy podcast. So today I'm very happy to talk with Len Epp, lead customer development and co-founder at Leanpub. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, Len.
Yeah, it's morning here on the west coast of America.
Yeah, and it's the evening now in London. It's all dark. So I'm pretty excited to have you today. I've been, a big Leanpub 5 fan for a while, actually. I was still actually in college when I learned about you guys, and I thought the model was super interesting. So it's super exciting for me. You guys created, kind of a concept where authors can continuously publish their books, even if they have written, like just say the first chapter or 2 chapters, people can already buy it. So we'll talk a bit more about, the concept afterwards, but it's super exciting. We also decided to do this interview to announce that Reedsy and Leanpub will start working together to help Leanpub authors create beautiful covers for their books, since it's one of the main things to discover books on Leanpub. So just for our listeners who may not know about Leanpub, could you tell us a little bit about, first about yourself and then about the vision for the company and the team, who you are?
Sure. Starting with who we are, Leanpub founders are Peter Armstrong, Scott Patton, and myself, Len Epp. Are you hearing that echo?
Yeah, you sound far.
Sorry?
You sound a bit far.
Okay. Do you want me to put on a headset?
Yeah, maybe it'd be better. Yeah, if you have them. Yeah.
There we go. Do you hear me now?
Okay, it's much better. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Leanpub has 3 co-founders: Peter Armstrong, Scott Patton, and myself. Peter and Scott actually had the idea back in 2010 when Peter had written on a programming book, and he'd realized that he didn't want it was completed before he started getting it out to readers. There were a number of reasons for that. One of which was motivation, community copy editing. And so he thought he'd give it and he can tell the story better than I can, but he sort of creatively added a link to a special, basically, chat room about his if you bought the book, and he built this community of kind of avid followers of his computer program would help him if they found errors and make suggestions, and then there's sort of like a kind of feedback loop of motivation where people are asking for the next chapters, and then he wants to give it to them. And that worked really well. And then he went with a conventional publishing company to do the book. It was very popular. He had an okay experience with them in ways the first time, but by the time he'd done his second book, he'd realized a lot of things about how the conventional publishing process just didn't, particularly, your book being obsolete the day it's published. That can be a problem, especially if you're writing in the technology space, change so fast.
Definitely.
And where if you're, I mean, I don't really like the term very much, but if you're a thought leader, you're far ahead of almost everyone else. So at the beginning, you don't have much of an audience, but the audience you do have are the people on the cutting edge. And by the time you go through some external process, you're leading anymore. So there is a certain kind of genre of book that just ought to be published as kind of as soon as the first couple of chapters are ready.
Yeah.
And so that was what Scott and Peter started Leanpub out to be.
This is interesting. Do you know what kind of communities he tapped into for his first book? He said like that there was a channel or something he could talk about his readers.
He actually created that himself. The way he found his community, I'm not exactly sure of the details, but basically he put it out there online. And the classic kind of early adopters, people who needed what he was writing about so badly that even a couple chapters in of things that aren't fully baked was enough to help them in their work, and help them complete or start and complete projects that either have been assigned to them or that they want to do themselves. And so they were ahead too.
And it's actually a super lean way of publishing. I guess the name comes from it.
Oh, that's exactly right. Actually, the first Leanpub book was a book made out of Eric Ries's blog, and Eric Ries is the author of the Lean Startup, right? So yeah, there's a connection there.
Interesting. That's pretty cool. So at the moment, how big is the team? So you were three co-founders, and now
three co-founders, and yeah, and so Leanpub's a bit of an odd story in the sense that I mean, it's not odd that we're bootstrapped, and we're bootstrapped by doing consulting work. It's a bit odd that it's been this long, but we just love Leanpub so much, and yeah, so the team at Rubos, the consulting company, is about 7 people right now.
Got it.
And so we combine doing consulting work with our baby, which is Leanpub.
That's pretty cool. So since you started back in 2010, so the industry has been changing a lot, and more people are self-publishing. Like, how has it evolved? Like, what's the big difference about 2010 and 2015?
It's a really interesting question to think about. I would say there have been 2 big changes in the last 5 years. Two of the most important big changes are, one, the ubiquity of smartphones, and increasing internet access everywhere. So basically, people have become, back in the day when the Kindle came out, it was like people thought it was very revolutionary, but actually it was this huge, clunky, with poor connections and even buttons on it. Kind of, remember that a keyboard, an extra expensive device. And I know Scott Patton here at Leanpub really likes to read on his Kindle because he says it's easier on his eyes. But basically, we're all getting accustomed to having these things with us everywhere all the time. I remember I lived in London for a few years, and I remember commuting, and you had to become kind of like proficient at the sort of ritual of reading on the tube.
Exactly.
At rush hour, right? Like you'd actually fold the book in half. Yeah. You'd keep it in your pocket here, and then you'd read it like that. And so people have actually been reading.
And you could still annoy people.
And you could still annoy people, and exactly. And yeah, you remember those guys who hold the paper out like that? Anyway, but people have become used to reading on smartphones, whether they're reading books or anything on the internet. And so that's the biggest change to publishing generally, I would say, is that people are starting to read a lot on their phones, and this, more or less, this is the future of reading. I think a lot of people would say. So that's changed a lot about how the way people think about reading books. Yeah. And they've just become more comfortable with the idea of reading on an electronic device with a screen. That's just something. I mean, I think like a lot, like I imagine like a 15-year-old nowadays would be like. That would be a totally natural thing to do in many environments. And the idea of lugging around a book would be like, my God, I can't even. The second thing is a little bit more kind of just social. But I think that the idea of publishing a book yourself has become something that's it's far better understood than it was. One of the legacy, one of the ways I put it is like one of the legacies of what I call like 20th century romantic modernism was the idea that an author was a sort of like a member of the landed gentry and ought to be living above the concerns of money. And this was a total myth, a profoundly misleading legend. It meant that people sort of, the paradox was that the people who set themselves up socially as those who were defending the virtues of high literature and knowledge were actually the last people you should be listening to about it, because they were profoundly ignorant of the history in publishing. Derek's first book, how he made that, the Nobel Prize winning poet, his first book, he borrowed a couple $100 from his mom. And he went to the printer and he printed his book off, and he went on the streets and sold it because he loved his poetry and he wanted people to read it. Walt Whitman, Friedrich Nietzsche, like, the list goes on. Much of Dickens was essentially self-published through magazines he himself owned. And so people are finally emerging from this legendary world they were living in which basically publishers convinced authors. Publishing companies convinced authors that it was the only legitimate way of getting your knowledge and art out to the world.
Yeah.
And I see things finally changing, you know, amongst friends of mine who published, you know, literary works and things like that. Even they're coming around finally. So that's the other big change. And we're still at the beginning of that, but it's happened, I think.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And so you were talking about Peter, who's, you know, kind of continuously published his first book, like based on the feedback he would get from readers. Could you tell us about, like, so your tagline is actually, at least on your homepage, is publish early, publish often. Could you tell us about, you know, like how that content is consumed? So you talked about, you know, how like, you know, people are reading on their phones and tablets and stuff, and like, so on the way, how is the content on Leanpub consumed? And as authors publish, you know, another part of their book or another section.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to answer that, I guess. So when an author publishes, I mean, they can put an email to readers who haven't opted out of it. And there's a process where you don't see the author's email and the reader doesn't see the author, and the author doesn't email. They can send a message if they send out a significant update to the book saying there's new content. So often people who've bought the book, if it's been published in progress, they'll read the first few, and many of them will actually then interact with the author. Authors often, Leanpub authors put or forward, you know, they put their email address in there and an invitation for feedback. So actually a lot of the feedback happens through email. So the people read the first few chapters and then they get update email, and they read them, and then they go back to the book and they download a new copy and they read it. Our iOS app, and it's slightly different, but they mostly read, we look at the stats every once in a while, obviously, and mostly people are reading in PDF, which is an interesting observation. I would largely put that down to two factors, one of which is we don't have an Android app yet, and our iOS app isn't like awesome. It's good and usable, but it's not awesome. So the best right now, probably, with the exception of some really great EPUBs that people have made, you know, usually the best way to read a Leanpub book is on PDF, and the data shows that. Also, because our early adopters have primarily been technical book authors, and I actually have an argument with my co-founder Peter about this. I think that means they like to look at books on big screens while they're working on something. And so that would explain the PDF, right? Like, you're not gonna like look at your book and then type in some code and then look at your book in some code. You know, you're gonna want it up on a dedicated screen probably. Personally, myself, I prefer to read I read like basically monks used to do when the codex was invented. You know, I like them to be big, and I like them to be on I'd like to be reading hands-free. So
it's interesting.
PDF is actually a really good way of reading.
It's interesting. So as you said, like Leanpub is for, I think, like relatively tech-savvy people. Are you guys trying to like kind of target like more mainstream writers, and would the concept work for them?
So definitely right now, Leanpub is optimized for technical book authors because it was, you know, largely built and conceived by programmers who were writing programming books. But definitely 110%. You know, we want people who write books of all kinds to be using Leanpub. We're working on ways to make that more easier to do, and to make it more inviting, right? Because if you go and look at our bestsellers and they're all like, you know, PHP and modern applications, you know, you're probably not going to put your pirate romance on there. So how does it work for fiction? Like, I guess, like, you know, it's kind of harder to, you know, work with your readers to, you know, release new chapters based on their feedback. Like, how would it work with them? Yeah, so fiction is a really interesting application. So on the one hand, serial fiction is a really old idea. Many of one of the jokes I like to tell is that one of the reasons many of the, you know, in the West, when many of the great novels that we have are so long, is because they were published serially and they were hits when they were being published, right? You might have planned 2 seasons, but if it's a hit, it's going to be 6, right? And so, I mean, you know, many of Dickens' books were published serially. You know, the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, Middlemarch, you know, all these books started out being published serially, if they weren't published entirely serially. And serial publishing was more or less the norm. And that opens up really interesting ideas. Like, for example, a novel is not a book, right? Like we say I wrote the book, but you actually wrote a text.
Yeah.
And it's only a book if it's published in that particular format. So for example, if I had all of the copies of like the magazine in which one of Mary Elizabeth Braddon's novels were published, I've got the novel, but I don't have a book, right? Or if I have the 8 sort of pamphlets that Middlemarch was published as, I don't have a book, but I have the novel. And so Leanpub, when it comes to serial publishing, what you would do is right now it's kind of clunky, but you would just publish chapters as separate books serially. Now, I think what you're getting at, which is really good, is that the idea of in progress publishing is different from serial publishing, right? Serial publishing is publishing finished works in serial.
Yeah.
Whereas in progress publishing is publishing something that like you might still change.
Yeah.
And I think the only person working on a novel that way is me, because it's a bit, and you know, the project I'm working on is kind of a complex political satire, so changing it along the way is part of the project. But that's kind of like performance art in a way, right?
Yeah.
I think most people would find it frustrating to read the first chapter of a novel and then have the author go, I changed it.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting how you guys are kind of, you know, coming up with new concepts every time. So like you came up with that concept in some way, or maybe, you know, even though maybe it may have existed in the past, but you still came up with the idea of continuous publishing, and now you're coming up with this idea that, you know, a book is only a book if you decide to make your text a book. But in fact, maybe people don't want to read a book; they want to read a series of novels, or I don't know, or something that's constantly evolving. So it's very interesting. It's like, you know, and he's super innovative with like most of the things. There's so many concepts on Leanpub that are super interesting, and we're going to talk about it afterwards. So at the moment, it's say mainly for technical writers, and for it to work well, you've integrated Leanpub with like many services such as GitHub, Dropbox, and a few others. What's the percentage of your authors using them? Like, how does it change the way they write their books, basically?
Yeah, most of our authors use Dropbox. And fewer of them use GitHub, fewer of them use Bitbucket, and fewer of them use our online writing process. And even fewer than actually just bring their own book. So we've got an option on Leanpub to just up that you've been working on yourself in one of the EPUB, PDF, or MOBI formats, or all three if you want. The primary way that working on Dropbox changes writing is by making it way easier and better. And I say that like I've done Leanpub, and I've interviewed many different authors, and they all say, you know, it's just this kind of magic, right? Because when you're working through Dropbox, you've got a file on your computer, and you just press save whenever you want to, and you work on whatever text editor you like using, a plain text editor. And then because you're sharing that file with Leanpub through Dropbox, when you want to publish a new version, you just go to Leanpub and hit the publish button, and it's done. There's no emailing back and forth, nothing. It's just the same way you would write when you're writing your manuscript. Is the same way you write on Leanpub. There's no extra interchange. That's interesting. And so it actually just makes things it just takes away a huge amount of complication from the conventional process, like, you know, uploading to the site, usually stuff like that. And
there's something else you're using, which is if you use the Leanpub editor, people have to should write using Markdown. So like, is it something that's very popular, or like, has it been like, because I feel like Markdown was super trendy at some point, like maybe a couple of years ago, and maybe not that much these days. How do you see it?
Yeah. Anyone listening who isn't familiar with Markdown, Markdown is a language that was written by, or a markup language or syntax that was written by a guy to make it easier to write web pages, right? So if anyone's ever done any HTML, it's like, you know, have to type all this code in, right? And so Markdown kind of replaces that code with, like, let's say, like square brackets and parentheses, and then you can make a link. So you don't have to do the coding. And so Leanpub books are written in what we call Leanpub flavored Markdown, where we've just changed a few things. But more or less what it means is that instead of going like you do like Microsoft Word, for example, when you hit Command B to make, or Control hit the B, right, to make things bold, what Microsoft Word is doing is adding a bunch of code that you don't see to the file to make that appear bold when it's being read by the appropriate program.
Yeah.
And technologically, and there are deep problems with writing books that way. It means that, you know, if a new version comes out, if you don't have the right thing to read it, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
universal. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and and universal across geography or industry or time, right?
Yeah.
So so Leanpub books are currently written in plain text. Means you don't see the bold thing turn bold in the text that you're writing any more than you would if you were writing on a typewriter.
Yeah.
Right. And so what Markdown is kind of like, you can think of it like the way if you would type a book on a typewriter in the olden days, right? If you wanted something to be bold, there are various conventions that underlined it.
Yeah.
Right. You might have circled it and said make bold. You know, Markdown is a way of doing that by typing into the plain text thing, and and by the way, like extremely simple.
Yeah.
Now that being said, there are two things. One, Peter Armstrong, is actually writing something new called Markua, which is basically Markdown for books. So it's specifically, it's sort of like in Markdown, but it's actually a totally new syntax, meant to be very simple and powerful at the same time. So that's what we're going to be using in the future. So it'll still be Markdown compatible, but it won't be Markdown. And Markdown is for writing web pages. Markua is for.
And do you think that this tool could be adopted, more, broadly by people who are not tech savvy?
So I do, but I know from experience, like my brother's an English professor. I actually have a doctorate in English literature as well. As soon as I say the word like Markdown to him, he's like, I got to learn something new. Like, I won't start this podcast, but it's like, screw that, right? Like,
yeah.
And a lot of people, as soon as you tell them they have to learn something new and you use a technical word, they're not exactly run to the hills, but they're just like, well, really? Oh, come on. But the analogy used for that is the typewriter, right? Like for like the history of human writing, you have amanuensis who wrote down the words you spoke, or you wrote by hand yourself with some version of a pen or pencil or something. Yeah. And then the typewriter came out, and you need to learn how to do it, which was time consuming. Mm-hmm. You had to buy an object or have access to like a special object to do it, right? So, but it's better. It's largely, in most ways, a better way of writing things, and especially a better part of the necessary part of publishing something. Yeah. As a book. And so I think that people are going to, in the same way they learn to use the typewriter, which might take you hours, the 5 minutes it'll take you to learn this new way of typing out books. That's way better. It's something, it will catch on. It will become a convention. People will understand that it's better, but it's going to take.
I guess you can probably kind of transition to a platform that's really tech focused to something that's slightly less, but where you still need users, need users who are going to have the minimal understanding of mm-hmm. of web or mm-hmm. programming languages basically.
Yeah, so we're going to make a WYSIWYG editor eventually, which means that you'll press the B and you'll.
Oh, okay. You're still gonna.
And you won't. So eventually we'll have one of those where you don't have to type any Markua out. Cool. You just type like you would in Microsoft Word. So we're going to make that for people who are just, because we want to be we have strong opinions, but we also understand that so do other people, and we want to be accommodating to them and build the best tools for their process.
Yeah, it's kind of finding the balance between being product driven and customer driven basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have the same challenges at Reedsy. It's interesting. Okay. So could you so let's say I've written my book either using Dropbox or your editor. It's ready on Leanpub. Now what happens?
When it's ready?
So let's say I'm publishing it with Leanpub.
Right.
What's the deal for me?
So what you would do is you would fill out the information that would show up on your homepage, on your landing page for your book.
Yeah.
So it would be like about the book, about the author, maybe a bit of teaser, like that. And then you hit one button, publish, and it makes publicly available to people if they buy your book, a PDF, EPUB, and Mobi version when they buy it. If you've used our writing workflow, you get all those three from one source text. You get all those three versions magically created. Then your book is up for sale on Leanpub, and the way that works then is we've got variable pricing, which is really powerful and awesome. And so what that means is, as an author, you set a minimum and a suggested price for your book. So as soon as you hit publish, it's available for sale at those prices. And what people see is they see a slider that has it at the suggested price, say $19.99, but they can slide it down to the minimum price that you've set, say $9.99, or they can slide it up and pay more. Now, one of the cool things about Leanpub is that because we pay such a high royalty rate compared to other publishing platforms, ours is 90% minus 50 cents per sale. How much we pay authors is a feature. So underneath the slider that shows how much you pay, there's a slider that shows how much the author is getting. And one thing that when we launched this, cool things started to happen. Like we'd see people paying strange prices like $11.67 or something. And we'd be like, why would people choose to pay a weird price like that? Well, that corresponds to $10 to the author. So they were taking the author slider. How much do I want to give the author for this book? $10. And often too, because Leanpub books are published in progress, you pay, if you buy it earlier, the author usually charges a lower price and they'll increase it over time as the book gets bigger and better.
Interesting.
And so we often get people who are like, how do I pay more? I paid this much, but I want to pay more now because this author deserves. So this variable pricing thing totally changes like the relationship. It changes what you're doing when you're buying a book, right? Like if you go into a conventional bookstore, you're automatically in like consumer mode, right? I want to pay as little as I can for as much as I can get. Right? What's on sale, blah, blah, blah. But in this, with Leanpub, with variable pricing, because it gives you a choice, all of a sudden you're like, you're making a decision about how much you can afford to pay, how much you think it's worth, what's your relationship with this strange person who's written this thing. And the coolest thing about that is that you can make the minimum price free. And so people can actually, you can have a project, like we've got some great professors from Johns Hopkins University who have some books on data science that are kind of related to a Coursera course that they have. And what was really important to them was that they could make books related to the course that were still available for free, but you could pay if you wanted to, because a lot of their authors, or a lot of their students or people who sign up to the course can't afford, to pay for stuff. So they can actually sell their book, but they can sell it for free on Leanpub, which is really important.
That's super interesting. Oh, okay, that's really interesting. And so like for me, what was really interesting is like there's tons of people, like going through, setting up a crowdfunding campaign for their books, and they're like, okay, I'm gonna raise money so I can, keep writing my book and then produce it at some point. What you're doing with Leanpub is you say, okay, I'm going to write the first chapter, and I'm going to find readers who are really interested in what I'm writing, and kind of start making money out of my books, so I can potentially, like invest more for the coming chapters. So in a way, like, do you feel like crowdfunding for books should work this way and not the way Kickstarter works, where you have to wait for months before you can actually read the thing? Or like, are you an alternative to crowdfunding?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it's sort of related to like about, pre-production crowdfunding in the first place, right? But like, I would say in particular, when it comes to writing, probably for most people, for most projects, the best thing to do is to make a little bit first and get it out there and see if you are getting attention and have something that you're already committed to before you start asking people to give you money for it. And as soon as they do, it's like if you're writing a book, it's probably because one way or another, very important or very fun for you to be doing it. And so if you just even one person on the other end of you, you're like, wow, there's someone waiting for it. I can't wait to hear what they say. And so I would say that, the Leanpub model, where like Leanpub, you can put up a page where you can ask people like,
Len?
Hello?
Oh, I think you were cutting off. Could you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, that's fine. On Leanpub, there's a page where you can ask people to put their email address if they'd be interested in reading a book if you wrote it. But they, yeah. It's possible that at some point we'll do pre-sales, because pre-sales are becoming quite the big in publishing land. Personally, I think that for books, I don't think I would want to personally give a writer an advance on a book they hadn't started writing yet.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Probably. But the thing is, but I totally do it for a movie, right? Yeah. Like if Spike Lee's like, he did a Kickstarter campaign, it's totally, I'll give you money.
It's not the same investment. You know? Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting because like my co-founder Ricardo has interviewed quite a few publishing startups, and that concept of lean and customer validation before you actually invest everything into your book keeps coming back basically. And I think like this is a really interesting example of what authors are doing on Leanpub. And so let's say, okay, so I've decided to put my book out there on Leanpub. Then what happens? I guess so you've built a community of readers over the years that you can probably target every time you release a new book. And so how do you help authors find their readers and potentially acquire more if there's a new genre that or a new programming language like that? I don't know, like how do you find readers basically for your authors?
Yeah, so currently we try to make the best kind of in-progress workflow so that people can publish and release versions really easily to their current readers. We try to make a really nice looking landing page, and we've got a bookstore that has various categories and bestsellers and things like that, where people can sort of, if I bought the beginner's book to something, now can I find the intermediate book on that? And we've links to, to obviously standard links to like Twitter and Facebook and things like that. And we've got right now it's just discuss. We're going to be making a better option, but actually you email the author with this double-blind system, or you can, do a discussion list kind of thing. But mostly right now, it's up to Leanpub authors to go outside the Leanpub ecosystem. It's up to them to bring readers. And so we do things to help facilitate that, when they've got to Leanpub. But outside that, we do some Twitter and some Facebook and things like that, and we've got our podcast series. But we don't do marketing for authors outside those things.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. So how many books have been published through Leanpub so far?
Let me get that trick up. It might take minutes for this thing to load.
More or less.
But actually, hold on. I can find another way of doing this very quickly here.
It's really interesting.
Okay. Had nearly 2,000 authors, and we've had nearly 3,000 books published.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So people keep coming back and publish new titles with you guys. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so you talked about that mailing list that they can kind of build on Leanpub. So it's mainly from people coming from the Leanpub community, or just anyone coming to the books page and thinking I'm interested, I'm gonna sign up, and then the author can use those mailing lists the way they want.
Yeah, so the way the mailing list works is if you express interest in a book, then that hasn't been published, then when it is published, you'll get an email. You choose whether or not you want to share your email address with the author.
Okay.
And we have integration with MailChimp. So and there's interesting, I'm sure you've encountered this before, but there's this debate, right? There's a certain type of person who thinks someone bought my book, of course you should give me their email address, right? And the Leanpub philosophy is that no, if you go to the store and buy a pair of shoes and people give me your email address, you're like,
they're trying though.
They're trying, but it's kind of no, that's kind of rude. And
I think it's interesting to offer because you get that pair of shoes, but maybe you'd like to get another one in the future. So I think it's fair to offer. But yeah.
So we also very in a light touch way make option to do that if you want to. But we've taken the position that it should be definitely opt-in rather than opt out to share your email address with the author. And we understand the profound value of mailing lists, which is why we do what we do. But yeah, we don't, it's important for any authors listening that like Leanpub, if you use Leanpub, you'll only see the email addresses of people who choose to give it to you. But there are a lot more people who don't choose to share it with you, but you can still email them because we've got this awesome double-blind system.
So is the fact that there's, direct interaction between authors and readers, I mean, is it the reason why you decided not to push all the books you've published to, the very famous online stores, the Kindle store, the iBook store, etc.? Or is there a philosophical reason behind it? What's the reason?
So the question is, why don't we sort of provide automatic integration with Amazon or iBookstore or all the other Kobo or whatever? There's a couple of answers to that. One is slightly indirect, which is we encourage all Leanpub authors to publish their books on any channel that they want to. So if you publish on Leanpub, we put no constraints on what you can do elsewhere. And in fact, it's a totally use Leanpub to use it to make your book and not publish it on Leanpub, but those files and publish them elsewhere if you want to. So we totally encourage the use of multiple channels if you think that's a good strategy. However, we're quite small right now, but we're also very ambitious. And our goal is to genuinely integrate writing, publishing, and selling. The in-progress thing naturally creates a loop there, right? And so we think that, like, conventionally and historically, all sorts of technological reasons until recently, but also for kind of other institutional reasons, you wrote some process, you published with another process, and then selling was another process. And that's still kind of how it works with Amazon, right? Like, you make your book some way, you give it to them with their really hard to use interface, and then they choose to put it up and they impose a bunch of constraints on you. So we don't provide those integrations for the same reason Amazon doesn't do it. We want to be the best bookstore in the world.
I guess, like, there's no way you can continuously publish with Amazon. I mean, above all, if you have like 3,000 authors and they're like updating all the time, and you would have to do it manually, basically.
Exactly. Exactly. So another you caught on to is that you can't in progress publish pretty much with any of those services. So at the end of your book, when your book is done, as they say, I guess we could have provided that integration, but while you're publishing in progress, integration just makes no sense.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So let's talk about when the book is ready in some way. When I talked with Peter, your co-founder, he was telling me about, like, some Leanpub authors are actually looking to get a finished product that they can sell on different stores, or if they want to make a physical version of the book, and that's how we got in touch, basically. And I was like, okay, well, if you guys need to work with top designers, top editors, etc., you guys can come to Reedsy and get an amazing cover for your book, or even like the whole interior if you're looking to do physical distribution as well. So I think it's interesting to talk about this. So as of today, or it started a few days ago, so there's now a referral program that's in place for Leanpub authors who can get a Reedsy coupon of $20 if they decide to use Reedsy services.
Awesome.
Contract with a top designer, or even and the top editor if they need editing. I wanted to. It's really exciting. A lot of our authors, I mean, when their books are done. I was just interviewing a guy named Jeff Geerling the other day, and he made a print version. He got his first test print version of. I think he made it through CreateSpace, and he was just like, "It's so different. It's so different actually having it. I'm so excited. Like, when I opened the box, he spent hundreds of hours working on his book, and there it is. And we've also had, our most successful Leanpub authors will at least a high proportion of them will make a print, and also try other channels, like putting it out on Amazon and stuff like that, or the iBook store, and because sort of why not. Yeah.
And one thing I wanted to talk about actually was,
Yeah.
you know, they conventionally say, you know, don't judge a book by its cover, right?
I was going to talk about it.
And it's so interesting because in the you know, what I call the romantic modernism about publishing and the books in the 20th century, the publishing company made the cover, right? Like, you know, the author might be given some input, but I mean, I know like not much. I knew it's very important for him to have a certain cover, and the publisher just like stepped on, like, no way, we're making our cover.
Yeah.
So my joke is that, like, you can't judge a book by its cover if it's published by a publishing company, because they're super, right?
Yeah.
Because like they've got this whole apparatus for selling that has nothing to do with writing.
Yeah.
But with a self-published book, you can totally often judge a book by its cover, not because even if the author didn't do it themselves, if they took the time and care and had the sort of like wherewithal to get a good designer to make a good cover, it means that they probably wrote a good book too. If they put that much care into their cover, they probably care about their work.
Definitely.
So it's sort of this funny kind of paradox.
Yeah.
Or contradiction.
Like, actually, when I buy a book, I often think that if I don't like the cover, like, I'll probably not like the content, above all if it's self-published, because like the author has chosen something, and there's probably a relation to, you know, how much I like the content itself, if, you know, I like or not the covers.
Exactly, and that might just be again, and yeah, that might not be some objective thing about the quality of the covers, but it's like you can tell something. As you're saying, it's very well put, that you can tell something about the self-published author's book by looking at it. Whereas with a published, if it's published by, well, now Random House uses that style, right? But,
yeah, it's true. It's true. And so going back to the Leanpub platform, when you read it and you're discovering content, have you seen that having a nice cover has, you know, big impact on sales? Like, what have you seen?
I would say I don't have any kind of like data, because it would be hard to objectively quantify cover, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, like, I mean, it's kind of profoundly important, and you know, it could be that actually having, like, it depends on the type of project, right? Like, you might have a project where having an extremely plain cover that's just black and white with typed out words is fitting for what you're doing. Yeah. But you know, having a cover that shows care and has meaning is just like, I mean, it's basically, it's profoundly important.
Yeah, it's also a form of art. So it's like there's a deep relation. For me, actually, there's a deep relation between that cover and what you've been writing. And well, it's going to be super interesting in the coming months to see if there's, like, you know, great covers coming from this collaboration. So so I look forward to it. So well, thanks a lot. I think that was really interesting, and will be very interesting for our readers to learn more about Leanpub.
Okay, thanks very much, and I look forward to interviewing you next week for the Leanpub podcast.
Yeah, awesome. See you next week.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.